In this video, I want to talk to you some more about routers. I briefly introduced you earlier to this router, and I want to talk about routers in general now. This is not the kind of thing that a rank beginner is going to need to know, but I want to show you what's out there because the woodworking field is very large. There's all kinds of specialties and tools that might be nice to have, but you don't have yet. So I just want to kind of alert you to things like that. With these teaching tangents, and routers definitely fits into that category because routers are very useful. They're power tools, they cost money, you have to buy them, they make noise, they make dust. That's all the negative side of things, but they do an awful lot of good for anyone interested in woodworking. This is the handheld router I showed you before. This is a larger, I would say this is more typical of a router. They get bigger than this, but of course they get smaller as well too. And like I mentioned before, a router is nothing but a high-speed electric motor. This shaft spins and it rotates a cutter which can shape wood. When I showed you this router, it was for chamfering some of our footstool parts, and that's the chamfering bit here. The cutter is 45 degrees to the shaft, so it makes that nice little facet. This bit is also a chamfering bit, but it's much larger. This is the kind of thing I would use mostly for outdoor projects. If I'm building, I don't know, a bird feeder stand, or I've used this on my mailbox post and other outdoor projects, putting a nice big wide chamfer on the edge of a pressure treated 6x6 or an 8x8 makes it look really good. But before we go on, I'm just going to show you a bit about how this works. So the bit is held in to what's called the chuck here, which is the shaft with a nut on the end. And in order to loosen that, this particular router requires 2 wrenches. So this wrench holds the shaft, because you can see there's a flat spot there on the shaft. So the wrench holds that, and then the bigger wrench, it goes on the main nut here, and it either loosen or tighten. Now, I've loosened this. You can see that it's loose, but the bit still won't come out. And that's because this is very common. There are fingers in there, fingers of steel that actually grip the shaft of the bit, which is there. Let me just get this around here. And just because I've loosened this nut does not mean that the fingers have let go of the shaft. In order to do that, I need to keep loosening this nut. So the nut is loose, but it's going to get tight again, starting to get tight as I loosen it. And what it's doing when it's getting tight is that it's forcing those fingers to let go of the shaft. So now that I've done that, I can just pull that out. I wonder if I take this right off, whether you can see those fingers. Don't normally take something like this off, but there we are. Yeah. Okay, so there are those fingers. You can see the slots allow the fingers to close in and to grip on the shaft. You don't need to see that, but it just helps you to understand better why most of the times you need to go beyond just loosening the router nut to actually taking it off further so that it will pry those fingers apart. So big chamfer bit, little chamfer bit. This is another bit. All of these are edge forming bits because, as you remember, they have a bearing, and the bearing rides along the edge of the wood, allowing the cutter to make a consistent profile. This is a little bit of a fancier bit. I'm going to use this very bit in this router on a piece of wood to show you what it'll do. But before I do that, let's take a walk over to my router bit cabinet, where I can show you how I keep router bits and some of the variety of bits that you can use and some of the things you can do with them too. So this is the cabinet where I keep all my router bits. And I have them divided into two categories. There's the 1/2-inch shank bits here, and the 1/4-inch shank bits here. Now, by shank, that's just a fancy word for the shaft that goes into the router and is gripped by it. So that's 1/2 inch. All these are 1/2 inch. And then smaller bits, 1/4 inch. Those are the two standard sizes. There's lots of things you can do with a router, and as you can see by the variety, there's a lot of different designs around too. So this one here is very interesting. This is what's called a panel raising bit. So this is designed to make the fairly wide decorative edges on the sides of raised panels. That's a solid wood design approach that's very old and very beautiful. When you see a door or a cabinet and it's got a frame of wood, maybe 2 or 3 inches wide all around, and then another panel in the middle with decorative edges, that's the kind of thing this bit can do, make those decorative edges. This is what's called a slot cutting bit. So when you want a slot along the edge of a piece of wood, this thing will make it for you, and quite deep, as you can see, because the edge of the wood is going to rest on here, and the cutter is going to plunge deeply into the wood, and you get a nice slot of an even width. This bit is fascinating. It looks kind of weird. When it's used with the router mounted in the table, this makes crown molding, believe it or not. Quite wide crown molding too. And it does a great job. You can save a ton of money making your own crown molding using a bit like this. Here we have a bit that is not an edge forming bit because it has no bearing on the end. And this is just for making slots in the wood of a certain width. In this case, the width is the diameter of the bit and as deep as you want. So you can make a groove, a 3-sided groove in wood. That's called a dado, or a 2-sided groove along the edge of a piece of wood. That's called a rabbet. This bit here is very interesting. It's designed for copying wooden parts. So it's called a flush trimming bit because the cutter diameter is the same diameter as the bearing, which means that when this rides along the edge of a piece of wood that you've cut to a certain curved shape, and that piece of wood is attached to another workpiece that's bigger than it down below, this bit will trim away everything that extends beyond your pattern. So it's a way of precisely and quickly duplicating parts with a router as well. And there's just a whole variety here. This is something that's taken me a long time to accumulate, so don't feel overwhelmed. If you stick with woodworking long enough, you'll have a collection like this too someday. But you don't need this, it's just something to look forward to. And each one of these bits represents quite a powerful capability, things that you can do with wood. So now let's go back to the bench, and I want to show you an edge forming bit in action. This is that edge forming bit I was telling you about before, and I'm going to chuck it into this larger of the two routers for a demonstration. The main thing to remember, whenever you're working with woodworking power tools, unplug them before you start working on them. So clearly, this is unplugged. You don't want any accidents. It's very easy to avoid that kind of accident. Just remember to unplug. While I'm thinking of it though, let me show you something. If you do stick with woodworking and you accumulate a fair number of corded power tools, you're going to have a lot of cords to deal with. And this kind of cable clamp is fantastic for keeping cords under control. It's just a ratcheted thing. I've got hundreds of these around the shop and my office. They just do a great job. Don't coil cords. Don't get in the habit of coiling cords around your tools. And even with longer cords, extension cords, never do the really common thing of, what is it, this kind of thing, right? The reason is because whenever you coil a cord, you're imparting a twist to it. And at first you won't really notice. But eventually your cords are going to get more and more twisted, and they're not going to want to lay flat. It's just, and they're going to become troublesome. They're not going to be well behaved anymore. So what I like to do is to take a cord, no coiling at all, but just to keep folding it on itself, so that, there we go, keep folding it on itself so there's no twist, and yet we make the cord compact, like that, and then put on one of these cable clamps, and then you're done. It's nice and neat, and the cord stays in good condition. Okay, the router bit is going to have no trouble going in the collet, of the router, but we don't want it to go all the way down. We actually want it to be a little bit further out than the lowest it can go. And why? Because we want to make sure the fingers that are in the collet grip fully. And if the router bit, look here for a minute, you see how the top of the shaft kind of flares out a little bit? If I push that in all the way, the fingers would want to start to grab on this larger area. And they'd grip firmly on that larger area where the paint is and everything, but that would not be where I want the fingers to grip. Because the fingers are only going to grip here on the wide part right underneath the body, and all the rest of it's going to be loose. That's not good. So we want to pull it out a little bit so the fingers are gripping, in this case, just on the machined section of the shank. Now, do you remember how there's 2 wrenches involved in this router? Some routers have a button you push that locks the shaft from spinning. This one doesn't have that, but that's fine. You put a wrench on it, we put the router bit in, and I'm just going to do it just finger tight so that the router bit stays where I put it. See, before it was just flopping right down. So I'm going to raise it up a little bit from the maximum depth that it could go down. I'm going to hold the shaft, and then I'm going to tighten the collet. You don't have to go crazy tightening it, but you want it to be solid. Do you remember from the previous video how I told you that the height of the base plate in relation to the bit determines how deep the cut is? So we want to make that adjustment here, and I can tell you that this is not sticking out far enough. Because unlike the chamfering router bit, which can legitimately be used a little bit or a lot, with this profile, you really don't want to just get part of it. You want to get the whole profile, because it's decorative. It's just meant for looks, and it's supposed to have the whole profile. So there's this convex area here, a concave area there, and then there's a straight section further down. So we want some of all of that profile to show on the wood that I'm going to demonstrate with. And in order to make that happen, we need to lower the base plate. We're just eyeballing it, but I think something like that. Yeah, that's going to do a nice job for us. So let me plug in. I'm going to get my safety glasses on, my hearing protection, and then I'm just going to run this bit along the edge of one piece of wood just to show you what it looks like. So isn't this a beautiful result? Here, come and take a look. I trust you see what I mean about dust and noise. We'll just brush this off. Now that's a lovely profile to put on a lot of things. We could have put that on the edge of our footstool if we wanted to. Nice and crisp. As I said, that router bit was spinning at about 25,000 revolutions per minute, so it was really moving along. But for the same reason that all wood needs to be sanded before finishing, the same thing applies to profiles, to routed profiles like you see here, and also to trim that you might buy from the lumberyard. And the reason is because what we're seeing here appears to be a flat surface or a straight run of profile. But of course, it was created by a revolving cutter, which means even though this profile looks straight and smooth, it's actually made of many closely spaced undulations, because that's how the bit cut. And those don't show up now, but they will show up under a finish, especially a dark stain. The challenge is, how do you sand this without ruining the shape? Because part of the attraction of a profile is not just the curves, but also the crisp edges. The crisper the edges, up to a point, the nicer it looks. So how do you deal with that? Well, the best way that I know of is with something like this. It's called a sanding mop. It's actually a Canadian invention. I met the man who invented this. As I recall, he was fishing one day, and he has a business selling abrasives and creating new abrasive products. And he dreamed up this while he was fishing one day. There's a whole bunch of little flaps of cloth-backed sandpaper put together, and you can put them in a drill, put it in a drill like you see here, and it spins, or you can use it in a drill press. And crazily enough, as strange as it sounds, these flaps are going to smooth all the surfaces, but they're not going to significantly dullen the edges. So you're still going to get a crisp profile. It's just going to be smooth and finish ready. And I'll prove it to you here. Just you see here, we've got some feathered wood. That's normal. You get that sort of thing when you're routing. I see it occurs in a few other places further along, but look at how the sanding mop just takes that right away. So my sanding mop came apart here. Let's take a look. This is what real woodworking is all about. I've often thought that to be a good woodworker, you kind of need to be something of a mechanic, at least if you have tools that need repairing. Okay, this is a left-hand thread. So in other words, it tightens in the way that nuts and bolts usually loosen. There we go. And there we go. Nice finish ready profile. You see how all that feathering's gone? We're ready to roll. So that's just a little introduction to routers and, and what they can do. I would consider a router to be, not a beginning woodworker tool, but very useful. They're used all over the place. They can open up a whole bunch of possibilities, as you're beginning to see now.